if you look back and you look at the different types of sovereignty that Americans enjoy, sociologists, cultural scholars think of two types of sovereignty. One is called thin sovereignty, the other is called thick sovereignty. Thin sovereignty is the idea that attracted those many non-Indian immigrants willing to leave for a variety of reasons the old world to come to the new world as they saw it. The thin idea of sovereignty was they're shedding the thick description of themselves as an ethnic group from an old Europe coming to a new America. And the thin relationship that they gained was a set of political rights, a political identity sort of washed of their historic, cultural, and social differences as American citizens. This idea of a sort of thin, uniform set of political agreements or bargains was the price of becoming an American, learning English, learning the sort of cultural ropes. This is what one scholar, cultural scholar, calls ethnic succession. If you see movies, and a quite good movie about this called The Gangs of New York, in which you take these identifiable ethnic groups from various counties and they identify themselves as like the Dead Rabbit Society or the Nativist Society. They are all caught up in this political economic struggles for supremacy on the waterfront and finally on the political halls of New York City. In that process, they become American, quite brutal, quite confrontative, but that's sort of America being born. But what they see is a different America, not the thick America, but the thin America. To describe an American Indian person, you wouldn't start with the fact that they were made citizens in 1924 and of the First Naturalization Act. You describe their tribal identities. You describe a place-based, culture-based relationship. And that's the sort of difference that you have between thick and thin identities. One is based and rooted in places, kinship and tradition. And one modern scholar, indeed several modern scholars, think that the world of the globalized future, sovereignty of the globalized future, is going to become even thinner. By thin, I mean that the affinities and identities are going to be self-selected, so that you no longer come from any particular nation, but you're part of a group that's self-defined through the internet, through affiliation, through membership, through corporate identities. And indeed, the world may become run not by nation states, but larger overarching economic interests, sort of the Globe Inc., if you will. And insofar as those folks are right that these modern technological phenomena are undercutting the historical, traditional kinship identities, maybe so. It's hard for some Indian peoples, cultures to transmit their historical traditions and cultural practices in a world that's been so penetrated by TV, the iPod, the internet, that their children may not be as dazzled by the stories of their elders as by the prospects of some sort of future avatar that they can become in a created world. And it's an interesting phenomenon to think about how sovereignty that has preserved the Indian people for so long may have to be rethought along these new frontiers. If you think of some of the great thinkers about how sovereignty and identity is created, you think about Frederick Jackson Turner and his thesis called The Idea of the Frontier in the American Mind. And his thesis was that these old immigrants were recreated as Americans, in large part because of their confrontation with the West and the Indian people. Insofar as the thesis of a certain cultural archetype being created through this interaction, the frontiersman, the settler, the rancher, all of these folks that we see memorialized on TV and in movies, those are sort of archetypes that we sometimes have nostalgia for. But the point that Turner is making is that with the closing of the frontier, with the terminating of that idea, that a new type of American had to be born. One not of abundance, not of the free range, not of the buffalo, but an American of responsibility and stewardship with increasingly scarce resources. One thinks about Al Gore and this idea of sovereignty in a world of climate change and global warming as something very different than the old sovereignty of borders and boundaries. So if you think about Indian sovereignty in a similar way, that how it's going to be reshaped to meet different needs and different realities, you have to think about self-determination. Self-determination is one of those odd code words that matured in what's called the post-Cold War era. You can read a great book by one of the leading political theorists called Samuel P. Huntington, and he wrote a book called Clashes of Cultures, Clashes of Civilization. This is the idea that in the future globe, the values, the priorities, indeed the future of peoples will be determined not by ideology. That ideology ended with the end of the Cold War, that this sort of struggle between good and evil, between democracy and totalitarianism ended. And that in this new world, this new unanchored world, that it's going to be a clash of values and ideas. Perhaps some say between the Islamic world and the other world, between worlds of tribal people in Africa, the value of colonial corporations that seek to exploit their resources. These new clashes that are, in a sense, non-ideological, remind me a lot of the old world, the old America, where tribal cultures did their best to hold out against incoming, basically imperialistic forces. So it's as if things never change. The challenges in the new global world will be these many, 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 if you will, mini states. Many states that perhaps are formed around ethnic collectives, ideas of religious factionalism. Who is more holier than thou? And in that new world, in which ideology is secondary to who you are, and that who you want to become is cast in sort of different doctrinal terms, not deriving from an economic text like Das Kapital, but defined in terms of adherence to the reality of belief. That becomes a new marker, I think, for sovereignty. And a lot of the critics of sovereignty say that you have to become more like the tribal Indians. You have to understand sovereignty as an enveloping cultural, economic, and social, perhaps even spiritual phenomena before you're going to be sufficiently insulated against change. So it's as if we have to go backward to come to the future. We have to become thick rather than thin. We can't see this as merely optional political arrangement that we can dispense with, as if we could suspend habeas corpus and thereby defeat potential terrorists. These ideas in which everything is optional and that we're really fully malleable and reformable, even if the Constitution suggests different, means that in the future we're going to have to rethink who we are. Indeed, one of the leading books by Samuel P. Hunting is Who Are We? It's a challenge to America to re-scrutinize who they are in light of the new immigration, the belief that we can build a wall that completely seals America as it is, often this amber from influence by the rest of the world, a world of sort of a fortress America in which we control our own economic, social, spiritual destiny, free of those intruding economic, spiritual, intellectual forces, sort of like China trying to cut off Google, trying to cut the people off from the outside world.